Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Insights, the podcast that focuses everything temperature-controlled logistics for the pharmaceutical industry. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by two guests. Firstly, Chuck Forsaith, who is the Vice President of the Healthcare Distribution Alliance, and Henry Moran, who is Director of ASC Associates. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
We're good, thanks.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Good. Just to kick things off, I think it would be a good place to start if you could maybe just introduce yourselves and give a bit of a background to your career so far, and then maybe about your current roles in your respective businesses. So maybe, Chuck, if we start with you, if that's okay.
That's fine. I've been with the Healthcare Distribution Alliance for approximately 8 years. Prior to that, I ran supply chain security for a pharmaceutical manufacturer here in the United States. My career background is in law enforcement. I was involved with a couple different law enforcement organizations before I went into the private sector. With the Healthcare Distribution Alliance, we advocate for primarily pharmaceutical distributors, but also manufacturers as well. My responsibilities relate to the security of the movement of products all over the world for the individuals or the companies that are based here in the U.S. So we look at supply chain lanes, we look at different types of technology to protect products when they're in transit and in storage. I happen to know Henry because the two of us worked together. We both worked in the same company quite a while ago. We've been friends for a long time. So that's how we've come to work together on the particular initiative we're going to talk about today.
Great. Nice. Henry?
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so I've been working with ASC Associates for the last 10 years or so. I'm a director there. We're a bespoke consultancy business that focus very much on pharmaceutical supply chain compliance. That's really the objective of the organization. So providing consultancy services, training, and also sort of facilitating audits on behalf of our customers and clients. Prior to that, I also spent a number of years working within the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry, as Chuck alluded to, in the same organization that he worked for, where my responsibility was very much a logistics role, looking for and looking after global supply of product from a production facility here in the UK to the global customer base. And then before that, it's really all been about logistics and supply chain and distribution and transportation. So working with and in the freight forwarding industry for a period of time. And then prior to that, within the high tech industry, very much focused on, logistics and distribution. So that's a little bit about me and what the organization that I'm working for right now does.
Nice. Great. Thank you. So just to bring those two together, I think a good place to start is how you both currently work together from your respective organizations, and also what's the shared mission of Pharmaceutical Cargo Security Coalition, because that's something obviously we're going to talk about today.
The PCSC is, again, is the security arm, if you will, of the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. There are a number of pharmaceutical firms that don't have the assets to be able to have a dedicated security person on staff. So it allows them to be able to take advantage of subject matter experts, whether it's me or people that I know, such as Henry, to be able to answer questions in the two different spaces. My space is more the actual hands-on security of the product, whereas Henry is more, his expertise is more centered around good distribution practices. One of the reasons that the two of us came together in this most recent initiative was the PCSC puts on a seminar every year in supply chain security, and we do it in New Jersey, usually draws between 200 and 300 people. And a couple of years ago, there were several questions that were asked by people in the audience, as well as the individuals that both Henry and I work for, indicating or asking whether or not there was a link between good distribution practices and supply chain security. And of course, Henry and I said there most definitely is a link. And so there was then a request to put together a program, an accreditation program for good distribution practices that would include supply chain security as one of the topics within that. I don't want to get any further into it because that's Henry's space, but that's how it came together. And Henry and I have been friends for so long. When this occurred, the two of us literally were walking to dinner one night with a boss of mine, and we all looked at each other and said, this is something we should really do.
Yeah. How long has it been running for?
Right now, it's up to almost 2 years. Even though manufacturers and distributors and retailers need to know these types of things, the three of us agreed on the fact that the concentration should be more so on the vendors that support the manufacturers and distributors, the trucking companies, the warehousing agents. Because these entities, we tell them to do things. I mean, you have to handle products a certain way. You can only do so. And they've always looked at us like, why are we doing this? I mean, why are you making us do this? And Henry very articulately can explain exactly why. And when we get the vendors to agree to the same things that the manufacturers and the distributors are already doing, it just tightens the supply chain up that much better.
Right. Yeah. Do you think there's a lack of sort of knowledge? If I was talking to a sort of head of pharma logistics from a pharma or 3PL, are they as aware they should be of the issues, or do they sort of hand it off further down the supply chain, do you think?
I'll let Henry answer that one.
Tom, it's a great question. I think what we certainly have found through this program and perhaps work that both of us have done in the past, it's very regionally based. So when you talk about requirements on regulations in Europe, I think that manufacturers, distributors, third-party logistics providers, trucking companies all have a very good understanding of what that requirement is, or is certainly perhaps a little bit further down the road in regards its understanding. I think when you look at the US, it's slightly different without getting into the complexities of all of the regulations. But as we know in Europe, the GDP guidelines, the good distribution practice guidelines are day-to-day practice for all of the supply chain stakeholders. And in the US, that's not the case. Unless you have a guideline or a regulation that is being enforced by somebody, then most organizations will only comply until they have to. So as part of the program, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's been about upskilling those service providers, as Chuck alludes to, the trucking companies that are being asked the question now in the US particularly as to, are they GDP compliant? Can they show evidence that they're operating to that highest level of compliance? And up until perhaps the launch of the program, many organizations, many trucking companies felt that they weren't at that level. And that's the value that the program has brought those types of organizations. They can show evidence to their customers now, or maybe their customer's customer, that they are operating within those very strict criteria.
So when did the PCSC GDP program launch? When did it start? And why did you launch it?
It would have been probably late or mid 2024, I think, is when we actually launched it. And again, the reason was we were getting inquiries from some of the industry leaders as to whether or not a program like this would be beneficial. More so towards, as Henry and I both, more so towards the industries that support pharmaceutical distribution, trucking firms, 3PLs, even the companies, the marine underwriters who are the insurers for those types of shipments. None of those, I'm not saying that they were completely ignorant of the requirements, but in a lot of instances, those types of entities would say, why do we have to have our trailers measured for temperature sensitivity and then regulated relative to that? Why are we moving products in a certain way to be able to keep the integrity of the product as it was intended when the manufacturer meant it? And it's the biggest benefit of this entire program is having brought everyone within the industry into the knowledge space of why pharmaceutical companies do what they do. And Henry will tell you, because he's more involved in the direct hands-on education of this. Some of the trucking firms that we've talked to who have been moving pharma goods for years had no real idea as to why manufacturers were telling them, you need to do this. And now, since this program has become live in these last 2 years, again, as Henry alluded to, we're seeing RFPs, requests for proposals, that manufacturers are sending to trucking firms and to warehousing entities saying, if you want to bid on this contract, you need to be GDP accredited. And that's the accreditation that we offer through the HDA.
Right, okay. And so the accreditation comes through the program, and is that accepted by most of the pharma companies?
Yes.
I think we know they're very strong advocates. And I think that it kind of goes back, perhaps, Thomas, to your other point about the value of the PCSC. It's a community-based organization that supports wholesale distributors predominantly, but also the manufacturers themselves. And, it's been through their encouragement and their desire to drive a program that ultimately knows that will benefit themselves. And at the end of the day, the patient. So, as we talk about GDP as an extension of GMP, that's exactly what, the community members of the PCSC want, and that was very much then also in our thinking when we developed that the program a couple of years ago.
One of the unique facets of this particular accreditation is it isn't necessarily something that where we come in and we check and see what it is that we're doing. There's an educational component to this. There are 3 levels of training that are required to be completed by a minimum number of employees to be able to go through the accreditation itself. So not only are we going and taking a look at what that particular entity does in relation to those GDP compliance requirements, but we're also training them as well. And on top of that, after you become accredited, and the accreditation period lasts for 2 years once you've graduated from it, we have a reference library that we've created. So we stay engaged with the companies that have become accredited and continue to monitor their progress, offer them advice and assistance in the space, and provide for them a vehicle by which they can go and research articles that advocate for good distribution practice.
Yeah. Okay. And so obviously you've both been on the ground here and talked to customers about GDP, and it's an area that we all understand reasonably well who are in the space. But I'm quite interested to dive a little bit deeper into sort of some of the real world experiences that you both had when dealing with customers on the topic. So what in your experience is the most sort of misinterpreted parts of GDP when applied to real world lanes that you've seen?
Yeah, I guess it really is the adoption of the principles and adopting that kind of quality culture. I think what we in our experience within the supply chain typically is you have so many different stakeholders doing so many different things, and some stakeholders are very aware of what's needed, what the requirements are, and others are not. And there's also sometimes this lack of knowledge insofar as that, one organization outsources a service or an activity to another organization, and it does so for whatever decision, for whatever business reason they make, but doesn't do any due diligence on that particular, potential supplier, subcontractor organization. So for us, the real world is trying to, I guess, take this quality culture that we know is so prevalent, rightfully so, from a GMP point of view, and really looking for evidence of that as we go through the supply chain. Yeah. And, making sure that organizations are aware of what the risks are, that this isn't a normal commodity. This product or shipment that they are ultimately handling will and can benefit a patient. And I guess it's also about raising that profile and that knowledge within the supply chain.
Yeah, and I suppose someone sits slightly offside this. I'm quite surprised actually to hear that there's trucking companies or there are forwarders out there who aren't probably au fait with what's required, but yet they're still being asked to ship pharmaceutical goods. It sounds like a grey area or serious issue.
Know that in the United States, as opposed to Europe, GDP is not a requirement. So that's one of the reasons why, and it's a good question that you asked, that's one of the reasons why there is a certain level of unfamiliarity with those types of requirements. Mm-hmm. However, we believe that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States will eventually come to the same level of need that the Europeans have when it comes to GDP. So that's one of the reasons. And when we make our case, when we go to a transportation firm and make our case, it's one of those, you can pay me now, you can pay me later. I mean, it's a good idea to get on board this now before it becomes, an actual requirement.
Is there something that replaces that in the US at the moment that covers this area at all, or is it left to chance?
The moment, so there's a very new piece of legislation that's just been implemented in the US called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which isn't good distribution practice, but it has a lot of elements of good distribution practice in the act itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that will evolve. Again, I don't know, but I'm speculating that will ultimately evolve. As part of that particular act, there's some specific requirements that are being suggested for wholesale distributors. And there are elements within that are very similar to the principles of good distribution practice. So I think it would be unfair of us to say it's regulated, but just regulated in a different way. And I think that the benefit of the program is that we bring that regulation, we bring that knowledge to the next level down, to those trucking companies, to those logistics companies, perhaps that have yet to even get involved in the sector and want to learn more and ultimately want to begin to offer their services to this particular industry.
Yeah, I think that US legislation, you're right, I am sort of slightly aware of that. And I understand it's very, very much a completely US-centric law. It's a law, I think, that's been brought in. And it's always, to me, it's a slight sort of quandary in terms of how a GDP European supply chain or compliance then flows into the US with a completely, but they're the same lane and we're an international market completely. And obviously that US law, I was talking to someone around it and saying, well, how's it work then? You're shipping most of your products out of the US into Europe or Asia. What happens? I don't know. I think it's potentially a problem for a lot of customers coming down the road, maybe, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the fact is that from a regulatory point of view, if I was exporting product into Europe as a US based pharmaceutical manufacturer, I would have to comply with the EU requirements, because upon arrival within the EU, ultimately as an importer or customer, I would have to show the regulator evidence that my product was transported, stored, distributed in a compliant way. So in a strange way, it almost becomes a self-regulating situation. Mm-hmm. Whether you're exporting from the US into Europe or Europe into the US, it seems that both end of the chains have to, in a kind of strange way, comply with what those requirements are.
Yeah. Okay. And if you're looking at sort of temperature controlled, say, vaccines at 2 to 8, what are the key GDP pieces do you think that people tend to miss or are most misunderstood when shipping, specifically pharma on this space, obviously, and say at 2 to 8?
Yeah, I think it's equipment availability is usually one. Do they have the appropriate equipment available to handle those types of very temperature sensitive products? I think it's, awareness around the transit time. The fact is that these goods really cannot be kept, on the ground for any significant period of time. Then, not the lack of urgency, but certainly a general awareness that this is a very temperature sensitive product that must move through the chain quickly. I guess, the other point, and maybe Chuck will pick up on this one, is not only the kind of the temperature element. And I think that's another benefit of what we're trying to bring here. Mm-hmm. Is the other risk here, of course, is theft. And you can have very, very temperature sensitive vaccines of extremely high value. And so it's creating that awareness around, think about temperature management, but please don't forget or neglect the risk of theft in the supply chain.
What both these programs do, both supply chain security and GDP, in my mind, and is they increase the visibility of your shipment. You want to be able to know exactly where your shipment is at any one particular point in time, not only where it is from a risk standpoint, but how environmentally it's being maintained from that same type of standpoint. We've seen in the supply chain security space, tracking technology be modified in the last 5, 6, 7 years to now include GPS tracking devices that also monitor environment. The company saw the benefit of having both of those technologies. Instead of having 2 devices on a shipment, wrapping everything around in one device. Mm-hmm. Henry and I'll give you one good story. We won't name who it was, but this was a client that Henry and I worked for that was marketing vaccines that were coming out of Europe and they were going to South Africa. They were actually coming out of Belgium and they were going to Johannesburg in South Africa. When Henry and I were brought into the instance, we were asked to look at that supply chain, not only to talk about how those vaccines would be managed from an environmental standpoint, but also from a tracking standpoint. And the company that manufactured or oversaw the vaccines themselves was under the belief that an aircraft would pick up the shipment in Belgium and it would be a straight flight to Johannesburg. What Henry and I were able to determine was that shipment came out of Belgium, went to Germany, sat in a warehouse for like a day or an overnight, went from Germany to Paris, and then went from Paris to Johannesburg. Mm-hmm. And when we turned and went to the client and said, do you have any idea exactly how your shipment moves and who touches it? And they had no idea at all. And that can affect the integrity of not only of the product that you're moving, but just the shipment process itself. The more times that shipment is going to get touched by human hands, the more opportunity there is for somebody to mess around with it and potentially have something happen to it. That's another of the services that Henry and I provide, lane assessments and things like that. But it ties into the visibility that you get with a solid supply chain security program and a solid GDP management.
Yeah, I agree. I think that obviously the weakest part of most supply chains is the handoff, is the tarmac.
Yeah,
we've seen in reefer containers when they're unplugged at port during loading and offloading. You can have 4, 5, 6 hours when the reefer's not plugged in. There's no power. So there's so many, but it's always during that handoff period, isn't it, where you've got your biggest risk for an excursion, and GDP really sits in very nicely. And I think I agree, Henry, in terms of that loading time or that tarmac time, having clear instructions on each lane that align quite closely to the product you're trying to also obviously ship is really important, because they have different parameters, they have different tolerances on the products, and obviously factoring in the packaging that you're putting around there as well, and the performance that you expect from it. I mean, they all need to be tied in, I presume, to this.
And 100% agree. Yeah, definitely. You know, the type of packaging solution that you're using, depending on the route, as you say, depending on, you know, the different stakeholders or different organizations that are part of the supply chain, they all form, as you know, Thomas, as you say, the whole understanding of what that risk looks like. And you have an obligation to make sure you're pulling all of that information together. You have all of that criteria, so you're making the best decision that you can.
Yeah. No, great. We're going to just talk about security in a second, but I was quite interested to understand, if I'm a new customer, just sort of walk through the door and want to work around the GDP accreditation program, what does that first 60 days look like? What actually happens when you become a member?
So as Chuck alluded to, there are two key streams here, and I think that was the other value that we wanted to bring to industry. We didn't want to bring a program to the industry without educating people. There's one thing assessing an organization, but if you don't educate them and make them feel part of the knowledge element of that, then, you know, the assessment process becomes almost every time unsuccessful. What it looks like is these two tracks, the assessment track, the training track. We always encourage any new participants in the program to start off with the training element, to upskill them and they're key people within their organization. And then once we've kind of done that in that sort of, you know, depending on where we are in the calendar, once we've done that sort of training element, that level 1 training typically is where organizations then at that point, then, you know, as we get towards level 2 and into level 3, that's when we begin that assessment process. We have 2 assessments. We believe that assessing an organization once identifies, you know, in most cases, some opportunities to improve. And then, you know, we give the organization the opportunity to make the changes that we've identified or make the improvements that we believe that they need to make. And then we come back to them when they are ready to have a look again and make sure that the gaps that we've identified have ultimately been closed. So that the first 60 days is very much about, I think it's very much about upskilling people, making them aware of what GDP is, the value that it brings. And then once they've gained that knowledge, then we can begin to assess them against the criteria.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. I just want to move into, you mentioned sort of what the other area that you cover is obviously around theft and criminal activity, and we haven't covered that on the podcast before. And I think it's a really interesting and important topic. So obviously you've both tracked organised theft for years, and you've got a lot more experience than certainly I have. What do people most misunderstand about how these groups operate and the sort of risks that are out there?
The risks that are out there currently are a lot more sophisticated than they were as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, both in Europe and in the United States, traditional cargo thieves, again, several years ago, would target vehicles that had stopped in rest areas or truck stops or places like that, and they would attack the trailer when it was either unattended or the drivers were asleep or things like that. Here in the United States, as far back as 10 or 15 years ago, I mean, we were losing as many as 4 or 5 full-size tractor-trailer trucks full of pharmaceutical products a month. I mean, it was quite bad. What we did was we created this advocacy group called the PCSC, which was even before it was absorbed into the HDA. And one of the things that we found was the only way to defend yourself well is to have knowledge of what's going on. You can't defend it against what you don't know. So there was a significant amount of effort to share intelligence about these particular instances. So every time a large-scale theft, whether it was in a warehouse, whether it was in a truck, whether it was in a sea container or on a rail car or whatever, we would take that particular instance and, without naming names as far as who the victims were, we would break down exactly what the perpetrators did, how they were able to successfully divert or steal particular types of product, put that into a briefing, a report or a briefing or a document, and share it with all of the members within the coalition. And what that's done over the years is, again, it's educated everybody as to the methodologies, and it's allowed companies to be able to refine their ability to defend themselves, whether that's adding GPS tracking devices, whether it's upgrading the types of seals or locks they use on the backs of trailers or containers. We look at Europeans in somewhat of a humorous way, and don't take this the wrong way, but to have fabric colored sides on trailers isn't anything we have in the United States at all.
Right. Yeah.
But to be able to cut, with a knife to the side of a trailer and take something out from the side of it. I mean, in the United States, all trailers are hard steel. I mean, we don't have anything that even remotely comes close to that. But there are ways of defending against even that. I mean, depending upon the types of technology that you want to use and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The PCSC has its shipping members, but it also has a large group of vendor members that offer all kinds of different types of technologies to be able to combat cargo theft or supply chain disruptions. And we act in some capacities, or sometimes, as a pointer index. A company will call up and say, I'm looking for a better seal to put on the container that I'm going to ship from Europe to the United States. What's the latest in technologies as they relate to seals?
Mm-hmm.
And we have several experts within the coalition that have that as a specialty. They know exactly what the latest technology is they're out there, and we point the people in that type of direction. Recently, the methodologies of the theft crews have changed, and it's not the physical stealing of goods anymore. It's the cyber intrusions into shipping processes where literally someone in the UK can, by infiltrating a shipper's electronic manifest and things like that, redirect freight to where they want it to go. And they want it to go to a warehouse or to a location that they control. That has been, not only in the United States, but also in Europe as well, that has been the latest methodologies that perpetrators use to take shipments away from shippers.
Wow. Okay. So if you're sitting down with a forwarder or a pharma client advising on this, how do you approach that conversation, and where do you see a pattern of the biggest risks? And are the risks different in the US versus Europe?
Not all that terribly much different in the US as opposed to Europe. The criminals are acting kind of in the same way. There is some subtle differences and things like that. One of the things when Henry and I sit down with a client is we try to do an initial risk profile. So we say to them, all right, give us a list of the 5 most prominent products that you sell. Mm-hmm. Then what we do is we do a risk analysis of those products. How attractive are those products to a perpetrator, where that perpetrator may in fact be able to steal those products and then reintroduce them into a supply chain.
Is there a certain type of product that is very vulnerable that you've seen?
Well, right now, a GLP products, the weight loss products. Yeah, that's got a real high attractive rate to it. One of my clients, or Henry and Mai's client, is building a warehouse in Indiana, state of Indiana, the United States. And that particular client has purchased the rights to this warehouse and the entire warehouse. They want it for their GLP product. GLP products are expensive. I don't know what they're like in Europe, but here in the United States, they're expensive. You fill that warehouse with that GLP product, you're looking at several $100 million worth of inventory in a 4-wall structure. What have you got for security around that? What have you got for cameras, locks, lights, guards, things like that? Those are the types of things. But going back to the original, Henry and I will look at the risk related to the product, and then we'll ask client, where are you going to move this product? Where's it going to go? I mean, in the United States, it could be from state to state. It could also be from the United States out to Central America or to Europe. And then we quantify the risk in those types of lanes. If I'm going to fly from the United States to Australia, and once I land in Australia, the risk there is minimal. Mm-hmm. If I want to send product into Italy right now, the risk is elevated significantly. There are a number of organized crime groups in the country of Italy, particularly that target pharma. So the methodology that you would use to protect that particular product in transit and in storage would be different in Italy than it would be in Australia. So it's a very measured approach that has different levels to be able to, you don't ultimately assign a numerical score, mm-hmm. but you can make an argument that says this is a very highly attractive product. It's moving in a very high risk lane. Based on that, we suggest that you minimize the number of handoffs that you're going to have for the product. I mean, get as few people to touch it as possible. Get as much technology on that particular product to monitor it, whether it's GPS devices, temperature control devices, or whatever that would be. That you have a system in place if something goes bad as to how you're going to react to that. Mm-hmm. One of the things Henry and I like to do is take our clients and put them through what we call a tabletop exercise. The tabletop exercise is we walk into a room, a pre-staged room that has logistics and security and administrative people. And in a simulated type of exchange, we say, you just lost a container full of product, or you just lost a tractor trailer. What are you going to do? And when we first start that, it's one of the funniest things you'll ever see because everybody goes like this. They point in different directions. We try to get them to develop a process. Okay, it was just taken. Who talks to the media? Who talks to the entity that was moving the product? Was the product being tracked? Who has that knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
What type of law enforcement do we want to get involved in this process? Who's going to contact them? How's that going to work? So in worst case scenario, which is rare, but in worst case scenario, there's a plan of how to react to that. But the principal focus of the supply chain security is to never even get to that stage, to be able to use assets and intelligence to be able to defend yourself better.
How prepared are pharmaceutical companies for an event, do you think, in your experience? I mean, is this falling on deaf ears in some sense, or are they sort of, rabbits in a headlight looking at you thinking, yeah, okay, we haven't even thought of this, but we need to get some, as you say, processes in place and everything else?
There are companies that are progressive. There are companies that, before something has happened to them, have seen what has happened to others and are progressively developing programs. But to be perfectly honest with you, more than half the time, it takes an incident to wake someone up to say, hey, we don't have a process and we need a process. Mm-hmm. And that's when the bat phone rings for Henry and I, and we end up being called in and we clean up the mess. And then after that happens, we say, all right, now that the mess is clean, here's where you failed. And here's where you need to improve. And everyone that we deal with in that space isn't resistant to that. They're actually very, very interested in developing programs that can better protect not only their products, but their company's reputation as a whole.
Who should own this in the supply chain?
It's a combination. You can't assign it to one entity. What Henry and I advocate is, that primarily rests within security and logistics, but it's also it's a leadership problem. I'm trying to think of the right word I want to use here. It's an initiative that all the way up to the CEO has to buy into to be able to make this program work. If you don't have senior leadership backing what it is that you do, security is a very interesting dynamic in that it is not a revenue generating discipline.
Correct.
If anything, it is a revenue draining discipline. So to be able to sell that to a CEO, hey, you need to spend all this money to protect your product. All right, what am I getting back from that?
Yeah.
It's hard to tangibly tell somebody until something happens and they lose a product or they lose their reputation. So for us, that's a real hard sell, but we've been able to do it.
Yeah, I just thought it's often pharma obviously manufacture products and then give it to their forwarder to have responsibility for the lane and the temperature that's on that lane. But then some pharma are very involved in that. Some are just handing the complete responsibility off. And it feels like in security, it's a similar thing possibly. They're saying to the forwarder, it's your responsibility and liability in terms of the value of the shipment. Or I presume some pharma heads are going, well, actually, I want to have end-to-end security on this because I've got a contract manufacturer in India. I'm shipping out through 3 different forwarders. I've got 5 handoff periods, and I've got a storage issue in the US. So I presume every client's different.
They are. They definitely are. What we tell people is you may have sold it, or you may have handed it off to a freight forwarder, or you may have given it to someone else, but your name is still on that product. If that product gets stolen or diverted or counterfeited, your reputation, you can't make the excuse, yeah, we sold it. It wasn't in our control anymore. It's in somebody else's. Your reputation rides from the point that you made that product all the way to the point that it gets in the medicine chest at the patient's home. I get very adamant when a client will sit there and say, the minute it crossed the threshold at the loading dock and it was picked up, that's not our responsibility anymore. And that's not how it works.
No. Have you got any sort of real world experience, sort of examples of a security issue or theft that happened to give people some context of the kind of things that happen out there in the field?
I could give you literally a couple of hundred. One of the most infamous ones occurred a number of years ago, and it was a burglary of a warehouse of a pharmaceutical manufacturer that was based in Connecticut. This was a warehouse that was not manned 24 hours a day. It was opened from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock at night. It was secured after that. There were no security guards surrounding the warehouse. It did have security cameras and alarms and things like that. An organized criminal element attacked that building on a weekend night. They went down through the roof of the building, disabled the alarm system, and then proceeded to fill a tractor trailer that they brought with them, front to back, double stacked, with pretty close to $80 million worth of product, and then drove off. There were a whole host of security-related issues around that particular theft, but it took us almost 2 years to be able to find the product, and through law enforcement means and undercover-related investigations, agreed to purchase that product back based on cents on the dollar. I mean, because the bad guys couldn't figure out how to liquidate it. We had made such a lot of noise in the media that this product had been stolen. We described it, the product number, everything else like that. They sat on it for a period of 2 years. They finally wanted to get rid of it. They negotiated with one of our undercovers. We met. They showed us where the product was. It was in a self-storage facility in Florida. We agreed to purchase it the following day. They went away. We followed them back to wherever it was they were operating out of. In the middle of the night, we stole the product back. So in the morning, when they came to open the doors and to give it to us, as we were standing there and the doors were thrown open, we arrested everybody in the crew.
Wow.
And that particular crew had been involved in a number of other, both warehouse burglaries and truck thefts, where trucks had been taken in transit at different times. I give a lot of credit to the shipper, the manufacturing shipper, because they took everything that they did wrong or that they could have done better. And within the industry, like I mentioned in the beginning of this, we shared that intelligence with everybody that are members of the PCSC, and helped all of them strengthen their processes, where we've never had a warehouse break since of that magnitude. And it's based on that intelligence share that we have.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it's great. In terms of last question on this, if I'm a farmer head listening, Lanes, which countries do you think pose the biggest risk in terms of percentage or risk scale?
From a supply chain theft perspective, I mean, there are a number of different organizations that publish statistics on the worst places to ship cargo theft and stuff like that. Mexico is a very bad place. Brazil is a very bad place. South Africa is a very bad place. But then there are certain levels beyond that. Those are the top 3 areas where, and you have to ship into them because people live there. So you have to make adjustments to how you're going to do that. But there are a number of companies that put out intelligence bulletins, and they grade regions of the world, and they'll even grade, particular countries. There's 2 organizations that are PCSC members that will literally go right down to the street level. They have intelligence on burglaries and theft crimes from foreign governments and from the United States government, where Henry and I can accurately predict the risk of going from an airport in a particular country to a warehouse in another location in that country. That's a discipline that has become more and more and more important over the last number of years.
And I agree. I mean, I think it's also about the sort of the physical attributes of it. It's as much about using the data. To me, I think to both of us, it's about building a whole risk management process that includes, theft in the supply chain, those areas of high risk in the supply chain, and then utilizing experts sometimes in country who can actually do the due diligence for you, who know the language, who know the different stakeholders, and can verify whether or not this particular organization will manage the risk appropriately. So I think, again, that's a huge value of the PCSC, connecting and sharing intelligence, but also connecting people with each other, and making sure that if you did have a particular issue, or there was a particular lane, or you had a certain type of product, that the expertise and the knowledge and the network that Chuck and the PCSC have created over the last however many years is absolutely invaluable in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, I know we're sort of getting low on time here. If I'm listening to this, I want to get involved, join, become a member. How should people do that?
There's a specific, if you went to the HDA website, which is www.hda.org, there is a drop-down menu for the PCSC, which gives you kind of a little bit of an overview of what we do. And within that drop-down is also an indication of the GDP program itself. And anybody that's interested in talking about, I can talk about supply chain security for days. I mean, and Henry can talk about GDP for even longer than that. So we're more than happy to talk to anyone about it. One of the things that's good about both these programs is we don't force this down anybody's throat. I mean, this is something that, particularly the GDP program, when we get a client interested in it, we tell them it's at your own pace. You will learn at the pace you want to learn at. We're not going to force you to meet certain milestones in certain times, because then what happens is people invariably take shortcuts to be able to make that. We don't want them to do that. So the two of us are more than happy to talk to anybody. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a vendor, whether it's a manufacturer, a distributor, a retailer. What we have to share, we think, is valuable to the industry.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Are you going to be at any industry events coming up that you'll be present? People can meet you face to face?
We do an event. Henry and I do an event together. It's in the United States. It's on the 7th and 8th of April in the state of New Jersey. It's the PCSC Educational Seminar. Henry will talk about GDP in that seminar. But it's a 2-day event, and it's open for anybody to go to. You don't have to be a PCSC member to do it. You can get it off the website.
Great. Yeah, lovely. Okay, well, listen, thank you both so much for coming on. It was massively appreciated and taking the time. Really interesting area. And we haven't, both those topics we haven't discussed in detail on the podcast. I think it's going to be very well received. So appreciate both your time.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for giving us the opportunity. We appreciate it.
No worries at all. So you've been listening to Cold Chain Insights. My name's Thomas Hunt. Please tune in next week for our next guest. Thank you.